welcome back to It's an Inside Job podcast. I'm your host, Jason Lim. Now, this podcast is dedicated to helping you to help yourself and others to become more mentally and emotionally resilient so you can be better at bouncing back from life's inevitable setbacks. Now, on It's an Inside Job, we decode the science and stories of resilience into practical advice, skills, and strategies that you can use to impact your life and those around you. Now, with that said, let's slip into the stream. Well, welcome back to It's an Inside Job. I'm your host, Jason Lim. This week, we are going to have a long-form discussion with Joel Lee from Singapore. Now, this is going to be a unique triad of subjects. We're going to be talking about conflict resolution. We're going to be talking about the martial arts Wing Chun, and we're also going to be diving into Neuro-Linguistic Programming. Now, Joel, he's a master in all three areas, and the triad of this conversation is quite curious, and we end the conversation with a lot of practical tips. So let me take a little more of a moment to formally introduce Joel. Now, Joel Lee is a professor at the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore. He's a graduate of Victoria University of Wellington and the Harvard Law Schools. And his specialty is within negotiation and mediation. He's also co-pioneered the teaching of negotiation and mediation in the Singapore universities and has played a significant role in furthering the development of mediation in Singapore. Joel has also taught overseas in countries such as Denmark, France, and the UK. Along with his other accolades, he is also the principal mediator with the Singapore Mediation Center. He's also a certified trainer of Neuro-Linguistic Programming, or NLP. And Joel has also been a practitioner of a Chinese martial arts, Wing Chun, for over 3 decades and runs his own Wing Chun school in Singapore. Now, I could spend more time adding even more of his accolades, but I think you're waiting for the conversation. So without further ado, let's slip into the stream and meet Joel Lee. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone back to It's an Inside Job. I have a brilliant guest with me all the way from Singapore. Joel, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, your name's come up a number of times with previous guests and also a couple of friends of mine, so I thought I have to have this gentleman on the show. Perhaps we could kick off our conversation today by you introducing who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm based in Singapore, born, bred in Singapore, educated in Singapore and New Zealand and the US. Don't hold it against me. I'm a lawyer by training, but I'm a really nice guy despite that. My full-time job is as a professor of law at the National University of Singapore. So not only am I a lawyer, I make them. So again, take that as you will. I as part of my job, I teach a whole bunch of things, but one of the things I've chosen to specialize on is conflict resolution. That will involve things like negotiation and mediation. So specifically the parts of conflict resolution in my mind that are amicable, collaborative, rather than adversarial, which may be litigation and arbitration and so on and so forth. In my free time, I run a martial arts school, and I jokingly call that my other form of dispute resolution. And then I also, from time to time, dabble with sort of aspects of psychology, simply because it interfaces very well with conflict resolution. I'm married, no kids, 4 cats.
4 cats.
Yeah, well, I should say no kids that I know of, but I'm pretty sure.
Okay, well, we'll leave that for another show. I'm most curious. Obviously, as you said, you're a professor. You're highly educated, highly experienced, and I'm just curious. What is the reason you went into mediation, into conflict resolution? What drew you to that discipline?
I'd like to tell you that I was bitten by a radioactive mediator and therefore developed superpowers. But the backstory, I mean, no real origin story. It's a lot of it is happening to be in the right place at the right time. So I read law. I studied my first law degree when I was in New Zealand. And I was exposed to negotiation and mediation at law school. I practiced for a year and a bit in a law firm doing some litigation work, and while I felt I was good at it and could do that, decently, I found it hard to sleep at night, and I thought that it just did not fit for me comfortably what I was doing. So negotiation and mediation called out to me very early on in my life. And then I returned back to Singapore, and I won't go into that story because that's way too long. But essentially, I started teaching negotiation and mediation at the law school. Back then, things like that were not sort of considered acceptable to teach, because law schools teach you about stuff. They don't actually teach you how to do stuff, and real law schools don't teach stuff like that. That's thankfully changed over the last 3 decades. But back then, people looked at you funny because they what's wrong with you? Why are you teaching this nonsense, right? This is all practical stuff. We don't teach practical, we just teach theory. And Singapore just happened to be at that point in time really getting into mediation, or at least planting the seeds for mediation. So it was just really the stars aligned, and it just happened to be an opportunity. I was here in the right place at the right time, and I kind of got involved in the mediation movement at a very early stage in Singapore.
I think conflict resolution is a highly needed skill in all sort of spectrums and spheres right now. We've talked ad nauseum on the show how societies, cultures are being, we're just being polarized to these extreme spectrums. And usually what bridges this is dialogue and discourse. But that seems to be being turned off. To what extent do you find that, people hunger for conflict resolution, these skills, these pragmatic tool-based skills that we can use day to day to bridge the discontent?
I think there is a great hunger for it, and of course there are many courses of people teaching this stuff. There is a great hunger for it. I think the majority of the world get this sense that something's not quite right. The world's being polarized, and somehow we're either not able to talk about it, or not willing to talk about it, or not having the opportunity to talk about it. Right, and I can say a little bit more later about why that might be. So I think there's a great hunger, and there are also people that may not know that they need the skill. So, for example, there might be people who don't actually know they're not really good at sort of resolving conflicts, but they think they are, and so they sometimes make things worse, right? But I think, their intentions are in the right place, their heart is in the right place. It's just that sometimes we need to be a bit, sensitive to the nuances of communication and conflict resolution and perspective shifting and all of that.
One part is that we just don't want to listen to the other person because we are shouting from our soapbox, and anything they're saying, we just write off. Then there's the other side of the spectrum that I see is that we've become so politically correct, so worried about the delicate flower in the room of offending someone that we're even afraid to bring up something. Because if we bring up something, it will be considered sexist or racist or something-ist. And we don't want to fall into that camp. And so for me, that also creates a sense of fear or self-doubt as to how do we approach, how do we have discourse about dealing with issues that can only be resolved by listening and understanding and respecting. You don't have to agree with what the other person, but only discourse can settle it. And again, this is from my layman's perspective, but what's your say on this?
Yeah. So there's actually a lot in what you just said to unpack. Right. I think so. So if you sort of excuse it, that I also kind of break it down a little bit.
Please. That's what I want you to do. Thank you.
Right. So I think one of the first things we need to do is we need to normalize conflict. A lot of the times people kind of don't like the idea of conflict. They don't like the idea that there's a little bit of a friction, and so the avoiders of the world or the accommodators of the world, in terms of their approach to conflict, might be, well, conflict's a bad thing. Let's not engage. right? And sometimes that's sensible, right? If someone's got a knife to you, I think you should run. I mean, I think that makes sense, right? If there's a tiger coming at you looking really hungry and you look like lunch, I think you should run. I think that makes sense. But by and large, I think most people don't realize that actually conflict's not a bad word. Conflict is a very natural part of life. It doesn't feel good all of the time, of course. It feels bad. But actually, if you think about how, for example, a tree grows, right? Essentially, cells multiply in opposition to one another and pushes it up. Similarly, how we move as a result of the conflict of our muscles. There is an antagonism to our muscle. That's why we can move. If they were not antagonistic in a sense, we wouldn't be able to do stuff, right? So conflict occurs, and you just put two people together, and they will not be exactly the same. Even twins, if you accept that they might be genetically as close as two human beings could be, will have conflicts because they are still fundamentally two different people and think differently and have different views. So I think one of the first things we need to say is how do we normalize conflict? How do we say, hey, it's okay that you're fighting, it's nothing wrong, that you have different opinions, right? And then that leads to the second point, which you've also made, is that I think we've forgotten, or we don't know, we've not learned how to disagree in an agreeable fashion. So sometimes I express this to my negotiation students or conflict resolution students. You can disagree without being disagreeable, right? I can say no to you in a very respectful sort of way, or I can say no to you as if you're a real ass. I mean, there are a number of ways to do it, right? And so as you well know, when we teach communication studies, we will usually say how you say something is at least as important as what you say, right? So right, so your choice of words, your nonverbals, your body language, and all that, adds to the total sum of the communication. So I think we've forgotten how to disagree without being disagreeable, right? And part of that comes from a space of needing protection. So I said a little bit earlier that people avoid conflict, and actually this is tied very much into what you will know as the flight response, right? The flight response that's theoretically part of the amygdala, the reptilian brain, a survival mechanism, right? But a lot of the time, when we have to deal with conflict and we think we have to disagree, we think it has to be in fight mode. And so in order for me to be right, you somehow must be wrong. And of course, that's false, right? That's really a false syllogism. And coming from my legal training, that's what we're trained to do, right? We think in a very adversarial win-lose zero-sum fashion, right? So when I'm thinking strictly in a legal sense, what I will say to you is, in order for me to be right, by definition, you must be wrong. And it is my sole mission to destroy your argument. And if I cannot destroy your argument, I will destroy you. Or that's the mindset, right? Whereas what we need to shift into is a thinking that it's really not a dichotomy. It's not either or. It's not zero sum. Both you and I could be right. Both you and I could be wrong, right? And then maybe what we're looking at is sort of shades, nuance, understanding. And understanding doesn't have to mean I agree with you. I can understand you. I respect your right to have that view, and I might still disagree with you. But that doesn't actually mean you're wrong. Now, of course, when we're talking about facts and stuff like that, we might be able to say there is a right and wrong and all of that. But when we're talking about opinions, when we're talking about views of the world, right, value systems, I think it's way too simplistic to think of it in itself either or sense, right? If you'll excuse me segueing into sort of a slightly different spin to this, although Please. It will be relevant. You might be familiar with something called improv. So improvisational theater work, comedy, and so on and so forth, right? So your listeners out there might be familiar with the show Whose Line Is It Anyway? Which is one of my favorite shows. A lot of comedians, the late Robin Williams was improv artist, right? And he was a master of it. Well, I've often said to my students, negotiation and mediation is more like improv than it is a play, right? Than it is a scripted performance, right? So if you actually have a script and you know, I'm going to first say this, and I'm going to first say this, and you're going to say this, and then I'm going to say that, but it doesn't work that way because you know, as they say, shit happens, right? Brown matter hits rotating object, right? And so you can improv, and one of the fundamental principles of improv is yes and, right? And all it means is I just, whatever, Jason, you tell me, whatever your opinion is, I'm going to say yes, which means doesn't mean I agree with that. It just means I hear you. And then I will build on that point. Now, I know that example is very simplistic, and of course it's a lot more complex than that. But it fundamentally captures the idea that instead of pushing back against what you're saying, right? Sometimes that is expressed as yes, but, right? And we've all experienced the but face, right? The but face being, you know, I love you, but, and we all know that we're about to get criticized after the but, right? Okay, and so a lot of the time when we teach people, sometimes couples, I teach couples how to say this. I say I love you, and then you just add in what you want to say. But if you go but, chances are, you know, you just erased everything that you said before that.
It discounts everything, right? The first half of that, right? It's the what you say after the but that really resonates with someone.
Exactly. So the choice of words becomes very important, because if I said, you know, I disagree with you, Jason, and my point of view is this. Okay, the listener doesn't generally get the sense that you're dismissing their argument. You're just simply saying, this is a different view, and I've heard you and I've listened to you, right? So fundamentally, going back to how do you disagree without being disagreeable is we need to learn listening, right? We need to relearn the skill of listening. Most of us listen to fight back or listen to defend. We're not really, truly, deeply listening to what the other person's saying with the real spirit and intent of trying to see where they are coming from, right? And again, I understand it, because it's tremendously a big challenge to your identity, right? If somehow they are right and they make sense, does that actually mean you're wrong, right? So you got to have fairly good ego strength. You got to fairly be able to say, you know, it's okay. I can get that you're right, and I could be right too, right? So role reversal is helpful. There is I often say to my students and people I train, I say, listen, it doesn't make sense to you, whatever they're doing or saying, but it makes sense to them. Don't assume that they're crazy, stupid, psychotic, or whatever. It makes sense to them. You just don't, you know, you're not sitting in their life, right? You're not sitting in their skin and in their shoes. So you don't actually know how it makes sense to them. So there's something called Miller's Law. I think it's named after George Miller. He was a psychologist in the 50s. And Miller's Law essentially says, you know, assume it is true of that for them. What you need to figure out is, what is it, or what could it be true of, right? And it's a lovely way of actually getting someone to sort of role reverse. Now, I know I've spoken quite at length now, so let me catch my breath and let you sort of say a few things.
I think what you've said, Joel, is so well articulated. For me, it comes back down, you know, as you said at the top of this conversation, you talked about conflict and how most of us have a negative connotation of that definition. We see it as a fight, but a negative connotation as towards a fight. And for me, the fundamental narrative for most people is conflict is bad, and that if I'm right, they are wrong. And it's like zero sum. I need to win this. And I think that's what most conflict comes down to. And so what I hear is that fundamentally, before we begin all the listening, before we begin the techniques and the skills, is to go back to the narrative, to redefine the narrative, to have deep discussions, not just once, but to understand the fundamentals of how we define the story of what conflict is. And for me, you know, it's great if you're a business student or negotiation, mediating, arbitration, what have you, and you go into that discipline and you learn that. But for me, I think these are fundamental communication skills that should be taught at a primary school level. I mean, that's
absolutely.
you think about it's a language in a sense, right? Like, I mean, if you learn French when you're 5 years old, you're fluent. You could learn Arabic, French, and English, and you're flipping back like it's one language. But if we learn conflict resolution, if we learn to, again, from a layman's perspective, to define and look at conflict, as you said, where I can disagree but not be disagreeable, and the multitude of other definitions, then I see this as that allows us to bridge things. We're not filled with self-criticism or self-doubt or self-loathing for ourselves or the other side. What is your take on this?
You're preaching to the choir, Jason. I absolutely agree. We teach young folks how to walk at an early point in life, how to do certain life skills, and that might change. What those life skills are might change from sort of period, generation to generation. Mm-hmm. We used to teach young folks how to write. I'm not sure they write anymore. That they just type, and their thumbs are highly evolved, I think is what it is now. But I mean, I don't know any young person who doesn't know how to use a mobile phone. I don't know any young person who doesn't actually know how to use a computer. Right? They're digital natives, I think, the term that we sometimes refer to them as. Mm-hmm. Right? We teach people how to talk, but we don't teach people. We teach people how to say things. We teach people how to read, but we don't teach them how to choose their words carefully enough to create an effect that you want to have. We don't teach people how to think about dealing with the conflict. Right? It's not just a skill; it's a mindset. It's how you think about something, right? If we can inculcate into somebody, well, don't do dangerous stuff, right? Like don't touch fire. You see that bear, don't go there, right? That kind of stuff. I think we can equally teach people, when someone disagrees with you, this is how you deal with it. Now, but the problem is, a lot of the time, we don't consciously think about it. We're not mindful about how we approach these things, right? I'm only mindful about it simply because I teach it, and I'm constantly looking out for how people's mindsets are and the words they use and how they deal with conflict, how they react to it, how they push back, or how they collapse. I'm constantly looking at that only because that's my wheelhouse, that's my life, right? But most people don't. Most people are just the regular folks, living a life, doing their best, getting by, sometimes more than getting by, and that's fine. And they're not thinking, oh, my child's having a conflict right now. How do I now model for my child how I deal with conflict? Because to be honest, you can tell your child all you want, but most of the time, your child's going to be learning from what he or she sees you doing. Experience. How you behave, right? That's unconscious socialization. You're unconsciously modeling your primary caregiver, your parents, and as the key people in your life, right? And I know that, and I have a very weird sense of humor. I blame my mother for it, right? And actually, my mother has a lot to answer for, but that's a different podcast. But fundamentally, your child is going to look at how you deal with conflict. Right. So if you get into a car accident and your first thing is to be frustrated and angry and get out of the car and cuss out the other guy, right? That's what they'll learn. Right.
Very true.
And that there's a very funny story that Robin Williams tells, and he says when his kid was really, really young, sort of a child in the backseat driving his car, and his kid hasn't learned how to speak yet. And of course, he gets cut, overtaken by another driver. So he gets a bit frustrated. And he says, "Fuck it!" And of course, the next words he hears from the back of the car is his young son going, "Fuck it." Right? Of all the words to have to learn at the first go, that would be the one. And of course these things happen, right? And I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall, with the conversation with the wife a little bit later, but we'll see how that goes. But essentially the child learns from the role models that he or she has, right? It could be the parents, most of the time they're parents, but it could be other caregivers and so on and so forth. So sometimes we're just so busy with our world and we don't think about it. We aren't mindful of how we feel and how we respond. I had to say to my class the other day, simply because it came up as a topic about strong emotions and how you dealt with strong emotions and all of that, right? And one of the things I said was, whatever you feel, you're entitled to feel. It's okay for you to feel whatever you feel. You could feel sad, threatened, depressed, angry, whatever, frustrated. That's okay. Don't deny your right to have the feeling. Acknowledge the feeling and let it pass. What I said then was, however, you don't actually have to act on that feeling, right? You have choice, right? But unfortunately for a lot of people, what they do is they feel it and they feel they have to act out a certain way, right? I've often said that the reason why society behaves a certain way towards conflict and strife and friction, I blame media, I blame movies, I blame television, I blame a lot of things that we are unfortunately constantly exposed to. So, for example, there isn't a long-running TV series where people deal with one another respectfully and with conflict in a positive way, right? Just think about all the legal shows that they might have back in the day: Paper Chase, Boston Legal, LA Law. I'm beginning to reveal my age, damn it. And you'll often see is that there's always expressions of anger and emotion and right? And there was a very short-lived TV show called The Mediator, where it actually was an American TV series where this woman mediator basically showcased her resolving disputes among folks in a positive sort of way. It didn't last very long. Ratings were not good because those things don't attract the attention. We watch a TV show or a movie because there's a big fight going on, right? There's one guy, there's Liam Neeson, taking on 15,000 troops just with a handgun, and he wins unscathed, right? We want to see that. We want to see the fight. We want to see the emotions. Because maybe our lives are so sad and miserable that we actually need to vicariously live it through these shows like soap operas and all that. But then we're not getting good role models about how to respond to conflict, because then we get programmed, right? And I use that word very loosely, but we get programmed, imprinted, that the next time we are thrown into a situation that vaguely approximates what we've seen in TV, we automatically do it. We don't think, oh, I got that from a movie. It's just that we react, right? And that's the insidiousness, I think, of media. The insidiousness now of social media, or a whole bunch of different things that our young folks are being exposed to. And nobody is actually saying, well, hang on a moment, how about we do a podcast, or how about we do a TikTok video, or whatever the young folks do nowadays, on how to speak respectfully to somebody else. Right now, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It's just, it's not likely to make the top 10.
I can see how drama and trauma are entertaining because we're drawn to the tensions. We're drawn to just the heat, because that adds to color and vibrancy to a story. Okay, we get that. But I think if you look at someone's life who's filled with drama, because they're not able to read their emotions and see it as information, but constantly see it as instructions of what to do, and they explode. You see their life as a cauldron of, like, it's a tempest in a teapot kind of thing. But what you're saying, what I hear is that if we're able to be self-aware, if we're able to stay in the moment, I think you said mindful of what's going on in our internal environment, assess it, notice it. We don't have to be defined by it, but we can use that as making more cognizant choices, making better decisions as to approach. Again, I think for me, for this to happen, it has to come. I mean, we can teach it in universities if you have that particular course in your curriculum, that's great. But I truly believe if we can bring this down to the fundamentals at primary school, even at daycare to some level, right? And it just becomes part of the course curriculum. Like if you're going to learn English, you just don't learn English in grade 1. You go through all the grades. You're constantly improving that.
Yeah. Someone was just telling me yesterday who about his son, and his son they get into rough housing in school and all of that, right?
Yeah.
And the son says, well, I got sort of reprimanded for fighting yesterday, and firstly. And I was just kind of talking him through the parent through, well, hang on a moment, we don't actually know what any of that means, right? Okay, the kid might have gotten reprimanded, but we're not sure what reprimands means. Scolded actually was the term used. We're not actually sure what for fighting means. And maybe he had a good reason for doing what he did, right? And so again, modeling, instead of being judgmental initially, ask the questions, gather data, gather information, and then model a response that there might need to be some kind of discipline involved, sure, but to model a response that just is proportionate to the situation, and taking that opportunity as a learning moment, a teaching moment, to get that person the child to reflect upon, well, how might his actions have made the other person feel? Or if the other person had pushed him first, how did you feel about that? Did you have to push back immediately? What else could you have done? And so on. So you're essentially, through your interventions, helping that young person create choice. Right, and if kindergarten students and preschool, and primary school teachers could have that training and be able to model that for every child that crosses their life, I think at least the world has a chance of being quite a different and more positive place.
Right? I wholeheartedly agree. Yeah. For me, that's an elegant segue into another part of your life, your discipline and your practice of Wing Chun, because I took martial arts from an early age, Taekwondo. And sure. when you start as a kid, you don't know anything. You can throw fists and kick, but it's undisciplined. But just like what we were talking about, when I started white belt and progressed through the belts, yellow, green, what have you, you learn greater skills and you build on the fundamentals. So for me, as I said, I think this is an elegant segue when we're talking about sort of primary school teaching, sort of these kind of conflict resolution skills, and then you go up. I was wondering, maybe you can more eloquently bridge this between conflict resolution and Wing Chun. Sure, and maybe you could tell us a little about your philosophy or the philosophy of that martial arts.
Yeah. Well, you just opened up a Pandora's box. We'll be here for the next 7 hours. Not to worry.
Hang on, folks.
Put on your seatbelts, folks. So what I've got to say is Wing Chun is probably the art that I've been at for the longest. I've been doing that since 1987. So I suppose by last count, over 35 years, I think. I can't count. I can't do math. So
you've been doing it since the last millennium.
I know, damn it. I look pretty good for my age. Yeah. But I've done a bit of Taekwondo as well. I've done Aikido. I've done a bit of JKD, which is Jeet Kune Do, which is a Bruce Lee sort of variant from Wing Chun. So I've done a whole bunch of different things. It's just that Wing Chun is sort of what I've settled on. That is something that fits very well for me and something I want to dedicate my life to. So I'll kind of speak about martial arts in general a little bit, and maybe talk a little bit about Wing Chun. I think most people's first response to martial arts, the connection between martial arts and conflict resolution, must surely be there's a connection, really, right? Because one seems to be a lot about fighting and conflict and violence, right? Whereas obviously conflict resolution is about managing conflict and trying to get people together in an amicable sort of way. And I think there are a couple of things to this. In Chinese, the word for martial art in Mandarin, the characters actually is wushu, right? And the martial arts, literally in martial arts. What's interesting, and your listeners, some of your listeners might already know this, is that Chinese characters are actually pictograms. So they've evolved from drawings and somehow became now the scratchings we call words, right? So the word for martial is made up of two words. One word is the spear, right? Which makes sense, right? But the other word is to stop. So martial arts, even though movies and everything sort of associates us with the concept of it's about fighting, at one level, it's actually about not fighting. So philosophically, then, at least my interpretation of it, and I'm very happy for other people who have a different view about that. Okay, but my thinking of it is that we learn martial arts to better ourselves, to discipline ourselves, to master ourselves, and in fact, where possible, to not fight. Right. So I say this to my students. I say that to my martial arts students, my Wing Chun students, when I say, listen, if you can walk away, walk away. If all the guy wants from you is your wallet and your money, and he's got a knife on you, give them the wallet and the money. That's okay, right? There is no shame to doing that. If you see them, a problem in the distance, don't be stupid. Don't walk there. Walk around. Go somewhere else. Wait a while before let them go away first, right? So there are a lot of things that you can do. And this usually falls into the category of self-defense rather than fighting, right? Because I think martial arts really is about defending yourself, and sometimes defending yourself is preemptive, right? Don't do the stupid stuff, essentially, right? The other thing that I sometimes say is listen, if you can de-escalate the conflict using your words, de-escalate the conflict using your words, and of course this is where we start to see a connection between conflict resolution and the martial arts, right? Because I've used many times conflict resolution words and conflict resolution models to just de-escalate a conflict, right? So that it doesn't actually come to a problem. I sometimes say that the best way to stop, to prevent someone from being your enemy is to make a friend. Now, that's not always possible. I get that. But I'd be willing to buy somebody a drink if it basically meant that, we both left the bar whole, right? And without holes, right? Without holes. It's particularly important, right? So we begin to see then the first connection between martial arts and conflict resolution. Now, the second connection then, I think, comes from the idea that many people, when they start doing martial arts, all they think about is fighting. But I think it's also in your experience that when you did Taekwondo, you probably realized that as you got better and better and better, two things happened. Number one, you got more confident in yourself.
Very
that
true.
you didn't actually feel the need to fight. In fact, you were confident when somebody was pushing you around, or confident when somebody was having words with you. You didn't necessarily feel like you needed to engage, right? And that's not fighting. That's stopping the spear, as it were, right? The other thing that you realize also is as you got better in your kicks, for example, because Taekwondo, you developed far more control. In other words, obviously, when a white belt was kicking you, okay, you could potentially be injured. But if a black belt was kicking you with the same kick, you could be pretty darn sure that black belt will actually stop at the right place, right? So then again, it's control. It's controlling over yourself, control over your own techniques, mastery over the self, if you think about it that way, right? So the same goes for all, in my sense, in my thinking, martial arts. Because the more you get good at what it is that you do in a martial art, the more you realize, hey, the need to fight disappears. I could fight if I wanted to. It is a choice. And if I had to, I would defend myself, my family, and so on and so forth. But I don't have to, because I'm confident in myself. I can de-escalate. I can avoid. I have a number of choices. And if I had to engage, I don't actually have to hurt them necessarily. So one of the arts that speaks a lot to me, and I practice a little bit of it, but not as much as Wing Chun, is Aikido. Right? And Aikido, the Japanese characters basically means the way of harmonizing energy. The way of harmonizing energy. Right? And what they do essentially is basically they blend with their opponent's energy. Right? So when the opponent attacks them, they don't actually block the attack. They don't meet it with force or strength. What they actually do is they step to the side, they redirect the movement of the opponent. So it looks a little bit like dance, but having had it done to me and having done it to other people, it's incredibly effective, right? And in fact, Aikido has been used by many people in conflict resolution as a very strong and powerful metaphor for conflict resolution. So, for example, William Ury, whom you might know, the author of Getting Past No and one of the co-authors of Getting to Yes with Professor Roger
I'm familiar
Fisher,
with
right?
the book. Yeah, familiar with the book.
William Ury basically calls it negotiation jujitsu. Right? Now, jujitsu is not the same art as Aikido, but historically there are links, right? Okay, so jujitsu doesn't imply I'm going to crash head on with you. I'm actually going to just move around you and figure something out. And so Aikido represents a very, very good way of thinking about it. There is another gentleman named Thomas Crum, who is an American, Crum. He is an Aikidoka. He is a very high-ranking black belt. I'm not sure.
What's the CRUN?
CRUM. His name, Thomas Crum.
Oh, sorry. I thought it was
last name. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Crum. Yeah, okay.
Right, so he's an Aikidoka, and as I said, I think he's still alive. I'm not sure about that, but he wrote a book called The Magic of Conflict. It's one of the best conceptual books about conflict that you can think of, and he marries Aikido with conflict resolution, right? And it's a great read. There are other people. There's a gentleman named Dobson. I can't remember his first name now. Dobson wrote a book about using Aikido in conflict resolution specifically, right? One of the, in fact, it inspired me. Those books inspired me to write a piece. It was a chapter in a negotiation book on martial arts and conflict resolution. I co-wrote that with a hostage negotiator from New York. And again, in that chapter, I explored a lot of these sort of interstices between conflict resolution and martial arts. So what I'm saying is that when you do a martial art, you learn to manage yourself far, far more. You learn to control yourself far, far more, and your techniques far, far more, that you no longer need the conflict. You can control, in a sense, the what we call the amygdala hijack, right? And that's only a good thing. Okay. The final thing that I'll say in terms of interstices is that all good martial artists have good stance and good balance. In other words, they are grounded and they are balanced. And why that is important, I mean, imagine in Taekwondo, from your own experience, you can imagine if you were kicking somebody and you didn't have good balance, right? You'd fall over before your kick would land. Pretty embarrassing, right? Same with Wing Chun, same with Aikido, right? You couldn't spin around in Aikido if you did not have good balance. Now, the connection between that physical metaphor and conflict resolution is simply this. If when you are engaged in friction or conflict and you are not both physically and mentally stable. Now, I don't mean mentally stable as in whether you've got mental illness or not. I just mean,
yes.
Yeah, right. You mentally sort of in a stable space. You won't be able to deal with everything that they throw at you. You won't be able to use yes and. You won't be, because then your amygdala just takes over, and it's fight or flight, right? Then you panic, and all kinds of nonsense happens, right? That will be unproductive, right? So being able to control your balance yourself mentally and physically, and they're interrelated, of course. I mean, if you're physically unbalanced, it's very hard to be mentally balanced, right? That is a very important part of conflict resolution, right? To balance yourself physically and mentally.
In the exploration of conflict resolution, the focus is not just on what is said, but also how it is expressed. There's an observation that we've lost the art of disagreement without being disagreeable, often rooted in a protective instinct tied to our primal responses of fight, flight, and freeze, or the F3 response. Too frequently, disagreements push us into an adversarial stance, where the goal is a zero-sum outcome, where one person must be right at the expense of the other person being wrong. Now, my discussion with Joel emphasizes the need to recognize his nuances in disagreements, acknowledging that viewpoints, opinions, and values exist on a spectrum rather than in absolutes. Joel compared conflict resolution like improv, where we don't follow a rigid script. It encouraged us to use the term yes and instead of yes but to foster understanding and collaboration. Now, an essential aspect highlighted in the significance of language choice, well, words shape the direction of discussions that can either escalate or de-escalate conflicts. Listening is noted is a skill often underutilized in conflict resolution. Instead of listening to understand, well, Joel says people tend to listen with the intent to respond or counter the other person's argument. Now, Joel elegantly drew the analogy between conflict resolution and the martial arts of Wing Chun, which underscores the principles of defense, de-escalation, and mastery over oneself. Training in conflict resolution involves learning not to fight, but to skillfully use words and communication to diffuse conflicts, to gain confidence, and to exercise control without aggression. You know, the ultimate aim is to achieve a state of groundedness and balance, both physically and mentally. And so in the second part of my conversation with Joel, we are going to continue the exploration of the martial arts, but also tie in another dimension, that being NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming. So now let's slip back into the stream with Joel Lee.
Someone once asked me, what's the difference between aggression and assertion? And my answer was simply balance. If you were balanced and you engaged in assertive behaviors, that would be assertion. Assertive meaning expressing your needs, your own rights, disagreeing respectfully, and so on and so forth. But if you're unbalanced, if your CG was somewhere else, that generally comes over as aggression, because your voice will go up, your heartbeat goes up, you probably end up using sort of pointy sort of gestures and all of that, and that gets interpreted as aggression, right? So it's strange that actually a lot of the behaviors are the same, but it comes out differently depending on whether you're balanced or not, physically and mentally.
Yeah, no, I find that interesting between aggression and assertiveness. And for me, it's a little different vernacular, but it is self-awareness, because self-awareness means you step back, understand what you want, and you are present with your thoughts and your emotions, and you state clearly your needs, your point of view, as you said, to be maybe to disagree, but not to be disagreeable. But aggression, well, that's not self-awareness. I think that's the F3 response you're talking about, the amygdala hijacking, Absolutely. Right? Where we just bang, we're aggressive, we attack, we fight, what have you. Looking at that, you know, if we've amalgamated the idea of Wing Chun and negotiations, or a conflict, let's call it conflict resolution. If we were to say a white belt, someone who's starting out, a student that steps into your room day one of semester one, and he or she is trying to understand, okay, I need to be self-aware. I need to tackle some of these emotions, self-doubt, of fear, of what conflict. What would be some pragmatic skills at a white belt level to deal with the turmoil, the inner criticism, the inner self-doubt of conflict as a white belt, if we can use that term? Right.
So, and we're talking about a white belt in conflict resolution as opposed to Sure. Well, I think one of the things first is for them to realize what the triggers are, and I think it seems obvious, but actually a lot of the times we actually don't know what is actually triggering what we're feeling. We know something's annoyed us. We know something, but we can't actually pin it down to something specific. It could actually be the tone of someone's voice. It could be the look on someone's face. It could just be someone, right? So this person just triggers you. It's possible, right? It could actually be, and this is interesting because this is all part of stimulus response conditioning, right? They say that music and smell, particularly smell, is a very, very powerful anchor. It's a very powerful trigger. Okay, so the smell of freshly baked bread for many Americans, okay, will take them back to their childhood. The first time they smelled it, they almost like go back to being a child, and so on and so forth, right? But you see, here's the funny thing. If you were involved in a conflict at some point in your past, or you were being scolded, you were feeling negative about something, and that scent or that sound, a piece of music, might have been in that room at that moment in time, your brain may have unconsciously connected that negative feeling to that song, right? Okay. So I could then be talking to my spouse, my loved one, my life partner, right? And we're just having a nice conversation. And that music comes on. And then all of a sudden I start feeling irritable. But because I'm not aware that that's the trigger, I somehow think it must be something that my wife just said, or how she said it. Right? If I was particularly kind, maybe I'm just eating something, I'm feeling uncomfortable. Maybe there's something poking me in the shoulder, I feel a little bit uncomfortable about that. But most of the time, we will directly connect it to what we're correlating to, right? The person we're talking to, right? Then and of course, anecdotally, that's how the fight started. So first thing I would do with this white belt in conflict resolution: what are your triggers? What are your triggers? Second thing is, how does it make you feel? And there are a number of aspects of that. Number one is obviously put it to words. Can you put it to words? What is it you're feeling? Now, it may be very surprising to some of your listeners that sometimes we don't actually have the words to describe what we're feeling. We either don't know, or there's so much sort of caught up in it that you're not sure if it's anger or disappointment or fear, or sometimes it's just an amalgamation. There's no word for it, right? And I know this because that happens to me a lot, right? So sometimes when shit happens in my life and my wife goes, "What's wrong? What are you feeling?" I'm not actually able to put a word. I'm not
articulate
able to label
it, right? To specifically describe the emotion, yeah.
Right. And back in the day when I was sort of far less sort of aware and skilled in these things, I would just be irritable and again, that will cause some kind of conflict and all that. And I can't blame my wife for that. That's me. That's all me. Right? Or sometimes I just get very quiet and go to a corner and sort of draw circles for a little while. And that's because now I sorted it out. So now I'm able to actually say to my wife, I actually don't know what I'm feeling. I'm not feeling good. And I need some time to just sort out the pieces, because if it's like 5 things stuck together, I need to go somewhere quiet and go, okay, that's one, and that's two. So I just start untangling the threads, if you get what I'm saying, right? So sometimes, especially if you're a child, you may not even have the vocabulary, right? Because like words like anger and fear and frustration and all of that is learned, right? I mean, if you think about how does a young person know what frustration is, some adult told him or her, right? Some adult correlated context, a set of circumstances, and says, okay, well, he's probably feeling frustrated, because chances are they are projecting upon that child. Because I would feel frustrated, therefore. So you say to the child, so you're feeling frustration. Now that might be accurate or not, but you've just given the child a label, right? But sometimes the child might be labeled wrongly, as it were, right? Yeah. So there's a big problem to all of that, right? But let's even assume that the child can say, I feel frustrated. I might then say, okay, point to where you feel it. Because most of the time, a negative emotion like anger or frustration is high up in the body.
Okay.
They'll generally be in the chest. You generally feel it. I mean, you can test this, of course, in your own personal memories and experiences, right? So it's up in the head area. It's unbalanced. It's up there. Sadness, depression, of course, generally down, right? So it's right deep in the pit of your stomach, but it's also equally unbalanced because it's not centered, right?
Yes.
So,
yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And so some of the things that you then want to say is, okay, great, acknowledge it, because a lot of people think, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I shouldn't be feeling frustrated. I should be better than this. What else? Right? And that happens to me too, right? I teach negotiation. I teach all this great stuff. That doesn't mean I'm the Buddha. I get angry. I get frustrated. I mean, shit happens, and I sometimes act less than gloriously. I mean, that's life, right? And when I'm calmed down and I go to, and I reflect upon my behavior, I go, okay, you know what? Maybe next time I'll do this, right? And that's okay, right? But sometimes for the child, they don't think they should be feeling that way, and so they berate themselves about it. Then they feel bad about feeling bad, which is not a great place to be, right? Right? So you get them to say, okay, acknowledge it. What do you think it means? And you slowly get them to learn to unpack and talk about their emotions. What does it mean to you that you're angry? Right? Is it okay? How do you think they are feeling? What could you do now to feel better? What could you do now to express your unhappiness? And notice I've shifted the word from anger to unhappiness, right? It's a technique. What can you do to express your unhappiness to the other person respectfully? And so you're using your language to just again, program, lay down the seeds for ways of speaking respectfully. That's what you might initially do with the white belt, right? I mean, if I was just teaching them handling emotions 101, right? That some of the things I would talk to them about.
Yeah, I think that's so well said, because the thing is, what I hear you're saying is that you need to notice your emotions. Don't identify with emotions, as you said, Joel. Notice them, acknowledge them. Because what I know from neuroscience, once we acknowledge the emotion, it's a chemical messenger. Then the messenger kind of says, okay, brain received, message received, and the emotion quiets down.
Exactly.
When I used to work with trauma, this is a couple of decades ago, we were understand about sort of core emotions, and that had two dimensions to it: valence, and valence meaning we felt comfortable emotions, or there were uncomfortable emotions. There was no good or bad emotions. And then there was the intensity of the emotion. And so when I used to work with people, I still do this in my coaching or sparring practice. I'll say, okay, what emotion are you feeling right now, right? And instead of saying valence, I'll say, okay, well, is it comfortable or uncomfortable? And as you said, where can it sit? Well, again, it allows them to have self-awareness. And you said before, between the difference between assertiveness and aggressiveness. Assertiveness is understanding that it's being present. I notice, I think. So I asked them, well, it's uncomfortable right now. For example, maybe they're very stressed, right? And then I'll ask them, okay, well, what's the intensity of that emotion, right? And so by putting these two scales onto a particular emotion, by them noticing emotion, not identifying the emotion, well, that allows them to be much more constructive in dealing and finding a constructive approach forwards to deal with that.
Nice.
Nice. I see a lot of parallels in what you're saying.
No, absolutely. So I tell you, Jason, I'm sorry, just quickly say this. I've learned something new today. I like it. I like what you just said. Because sometimes when I'm teaching students about emotions, one of the things I do tell them is I say, well, firstly, identify the class of emotions that you're feeling. So is this called in the anger category, or is it, Sure. And then at what level within the class are you? Because being furious is quite different from being annoyed, right? And so what you would refer to as intensity, right? Yeah. Right. And so if somebody was just feeling a bit peeved, and you identify me as furious, that's not really helpful, right? And you, of course, if they're being furious, then you need to acknowledge them at that point, and then try to help them, bring it down to the correct level, right? Yeah. So I'm sorry I interrupted that.
No, not at all. But
I just like what you said.
Well, just for our listeners, the way we're talking about it, it could be as simple as, okay, you're feeling frustrated. On a scale of 1, 10 is like you're, a mushroom cloud. 1, you're just a little peeved, right? Where are you? And so it's about putting an objective number on subjective feeling. So they'll say, well, I'm 7. Well, then you can walk them back and say, okay, how do we move it back down to 6.5? Again, it gives them a sense of self-efficacy. They're thinking, okay, this is what I can do. And this is very action-oriented. And then we start discussing it again. And as you said, with that white belt, we just use that scenario. When you ask those questions, okay, what are your triggers? How's the trigger? How do you want to deal with it? Well, that makes them cognizant, right? From what I hear from your practice, right? I'm sure to some extent this is also in martial arts, right? But let me flip the coin here a little. Let's say they understand, okay, I need to do conflict and such, but they are so riddled with self-doubt and self-criticism that they don't have the confidence to move into conflict, but they understand all the theory and how to tackle it. But when it actually comes from theory to practice, they get cold feet. They let the bus run them over.
Sure.
How do you help them find that confidence when they have hardly any experience?
Yeah, I think they're so again, as with many of the things we've talked about, there are a bunch of things here. So again, let's unpack that, right? At one point, I think what you and I have been doing with people, helping people with their emotions, is in essence putting them at cause, right? Putting them at the cause of whatever their universe may be, right? Rather than things are happening to us and I can't help my emotions. You say, well, actually, you feel what you feel, and that's okay. and let's focus on what you can actually do about it, right? And that's putting them at cause, gives them agency, gives them empowerment, and gives them a sense of efficacy. Is I think the term you use. I think similarly when we then talk about confidence. So I see this a lot in my negotiation students. When I teach them negotiation, they know the stuff, they could do it, but some fold, some don't have the confidence, is what you're talking about. But oddly, there's another group of people that actually can't manage their urge to win. And by winning, obviously, the total destruction.
Very competitive, yeah.
Exactly, right? So it's not enough to know what to do. I could teach you skills, but if you can't carry them out, if you don't have the right mindset to carry them out, right? So there must be a congruence between how you think about it and the things that you're doing, right? And I know all of us have had the experience of listening to somebody, and they do all the active listening training. I hear you, but you can tell from their eyes, right? Lights are on, but nobody's at home. They're not really listening to you, right? There's an incongruence. Yeah. You're not listening with your heart. Right, it's the same. People can engage in collaborative behaviors, but you can tell that they're not thinking collaboratively. They're trying to trick you. They're trying to use collaborative words to narrow you into a corner, right? And it's actually more obvious than one might think. But people think they'll get away with it. So I have to deal with both sides of the equation, right? I got to get them to understand that learning the things itself is not sufficient. You need to actually do it. So for example, changing mindsets. How do we do this, right? How do we unpack some of the things they're thinking, the consequences of their actions, and so on and so forth? But if we talk about confidence, how do we give someone confidence? Would you like the proper answer? Would you like the controversial answer?
Controversial, please.
You like the controversial answer. You won't like it. No. If I think about it from an NLP perspective, all right, and so one of my misspent things I do in my misspent youth is a field called Neuro-Linguistic Programming. Many people have a love-hate relationship with it, and we talked about this before. But in NLP, we generally say that the notion of confidence is a state, right? It's an emotion, it's a feeling. Right? And any feeling that you want to have, you can actually have right now. The problem with having confidence is having confidence without competence. In other words, I could make you confident that you could do brain surgery, but I'm not confident you can do brain surgery simply because you haven't had the training. Does that make sense? So it would be irresponsible to give anyone confidence if they didn't have the competence in the first place. Right? However, for somebody that actually has the competence and what they actually need is confidence, then you've got to figure out what the leverage point is, what the button is. Because why do they not have confidence? Is it because they don't see themselves as a confident person, which is an identity statement? They don't believe that they can have confidence, which is a sort of at the level of their beliefs, for example. Maybe it's because they don't have any competence, they don't have skill sets, so therefore they're not confident, right? And depending on what it is, so for example, the simplest way of getting someone to be confident of something is familiarity. I'll basically say, do it with me, practice it with me, right? So practice can build confidence. Simply because if you keep doing it and you're doing it right, and you just repeat it, it doesn't matter that there's no variety. Just do the same thing over and over, damn it, and you get confident that you'll be able to do it, right? Okay, and that's how a lot of children learn, right? They walk, they fall, and they just keep at it, and eventually they have confidence, partly because they're also developing the skills and the musculature and all of that, right? So that's one way of doing it. Sometimes you don't actually have that opportunity. So sometimes somebody is not confident, not because they haven't had the practice, but because they've got a little naggy voice in their head. I don't know if you're familiar with that inner dialogue, that inner voice.
Yeah, the little self-critical voice.
The critical voice, right? The critical voice, right? Now, I know that some of our listeners right now are saying to themselves, I don't have a critical voice. Well, guys, that's the voice. That's the voice that says I don't have a critical voice, right? And so we have voices in our head. I mean, how the hell they got there, I'm not sure. But we have, and ironically, those voices aren't always ours. So I have my mother's voice in
What do
my
you mean?
head,
Oh, so okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
right? Right. So the voices in my head, they're not necessarily my own, although I have my own. Right. And so sometimes it's a big party inside my head because there are a lot of voices in there. And they're all having a nice time, watching Robin Williams. But most of the time it becomes a problem because that inner voice is sort of, being down on us, saying, you're not good enough, whatever. Right. And some of those voices got implanted when we were very young in school. Okay. You're stupid. Right? A teacher tells you this, right? I mean, they shouldn't ever say this to their child, but sometimes teachers do, right? Because they're frustrated, for example. Maybe they're having a bad day. So they're not bad people. It's just they did a thing that's not particularly helpful. Fair enough. But what the child hears, I'm stupid. I'll never learn. And they carry that into their adulthood, right? Now, as somebody who's worked with people before, I know you've had to unpack beliefs in adults that were actually installed at a very, it's just that those beliefs never got updated, even as the guy grew up 30 years, for example, right? So sometimes I have to teach them firstly to identify the voice and what are they saying and how to change that voice. Now, and this is where, for example, NLP might depart from some other forms of therapy or school or of change, because we don't change what's being said. We actually change how it's said. Okay, so
can you elaborate on that, for example?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you a real life example, right? So I used to get very, very upset when people were late. So I'm one of those people that's always early and on time, that kind of stuff. And as a young person, I would 50% of the world's usually late. 50% are usually on time. And I would just get seriously upset, and I'd say, "Wow, these guys are just out to make my life miserable and all that, right?" And then when I first took my first NLP training, my trainer, Sid Jacobson, a very, very intelligent man, basically said, "Well, hang on a moment. When you're upset like that, right? What are you hearing in your head?" And I'd never really thought about listening to the voices in my head, right? So I looked at him like, you're the crazy one, right? And then he goes, no, just humor me, right? Whose voice is in your head? Yeah. And I went, my God, it's my mother's voice. And you got to understand my mother. My mother is a person who is always early, always. So if you are not early with her, she thinks you're late, even though you're actually early, right? Is that kind of and that's my mother. I love her tremendously, right? And so I've got my mother's voice in my head, and she's speaking in a high pitch and very, very fast. And she's saying, "You're going to be late. You're going to be late. You're going to be late. You're going to be." So she's literally nagging me inside my head. And I went, my God, how did she get in there? Right. And I actually do know, because "you're going to be late" is something I hear a lot when I was in my younger years. That's how it got installed, right, as it were. So Sid, my friend, my trainer, said, "Hey, listen, you want to try something strange?" I said, "Sure, I'm all up for trying something strange. That's just me." He said, "What if your mother's voice was Donald Duck's?" And I went, "What?" He says, just humor me, right? Make that voice Donald Duck's voice. It's saying the same thing. You're late, but you hear it as, and Donald Duck's voice, right? And I did it, and I fell down laughing. I could not stop laughing for about a couple of minutes, because firstly it was so funny, and then he looked at me and said, "Do you feel differently?" And I went, "Shit, I do." And so that was when I learned that if I change the modalities of how that voice is. So, for example, other things I tried with my mother's voice was I went to slow it down. So instead of my mother's voice in a high-pitched voice, it went really, really low, like a man's voice, and speaking very slowly. So her voice, and now in the deep baritone, a deep bass going, "You're late," and it doesn't have the same effect, right? And that really solved my problem about being upset with other people being late. Okay, it created a new problem. The new problem was, now every time I saw my mother, I had to stop from laughing, because I kept thinking Donald Duck, right? Which was a different problem. It's a happy problem. It's a happy problem. So if they had an inner voice that was nagging on them, I might intervene that way, for example, right? If they were not feeling confident because maybe they can't somehow access it, they can't summon it, I might use a process called anchoring in NLP, which is stimulus response conditioning. It's Pavlovian, basically, right? You get them to remember a time of confidence, you amplify it, and then you connect it to a particular stimulus, and then you call up that stimulus and reconnect it to the situation in which you wanted them to be confident in, right? It sounds complicated, but it's a fairly straightforward concept. It's basically strict Pavlovian conditioning, right? And that works pretty well. Now, I recently did something with a student as well that worked really well. So I'd like to just quickly share that with you. Please. Is basically, she said she wanted to feel more confidence. And I said, okay, so what do you feel now? And she said, well, I feel upset. I said, okay, where do you feel the upset? So I got her literally to point to where it was. And she said it was up here in the neck. I said, okay, so if that you had a shape to that upset, what would it be? And she said, oh, it's like a ring around my neck. I said, okay. And, does that ring have a color? And she goes, oh, it's red. I say, okay, great. Does it have a like sensation to it? Like, there's a pulse, or is it just there? Is it cold? Is it warm? Basically things like that, right? In NLP, we call these submodalities. And
Sorry,
she goes,
you call them submodalities?
Okay. Submodalities.
Different descriptions of whatever.
Right.
Okay, got it.
Right. Yeah. So actually, if someone is angry, for example, I'd say, okay, where do you feel it? Point to it. What shape is it? So I get them to convert the emotion to a bunch of descriptions and sensations, and that usually takes away, the kinesthetic of it, right? So anyway, I basically said, okay, you've got a red ring around here that's pulsing, and it feels like you're choking. Yep. She goes, yep. I said, okay, so what would happen if you took that ring and you made it a small pulsing circle of a pleasing color, and if you moved it down into your chest, and it's pulsing gently but powerfully, like a heartbeat. And kudos to her. She didn't look at me funny at all when I suggested that. She didn't side eye me. She didn't go like, you're nuts, right? Which is what I did to Sid. And she said, yeah, okay, I'll try that. And that in a nutshell solved the problem. I mean, it was about a 45-minute intervention. It was a 45-minute conversation. Okay, but fundamentally, what we did was to take something and change it to something else, and that fixed it. In a sense, it kind of gave her the confidence she felt she needed. And as far as I know, it's still stuck today. I obviously won't mention who this person is because I want to respect their confidentiality. Mm-hmm. But it's someone I'm still in contact with, and it seems that intervention seems to have sort of taken root. So that's I'm perfectly happy about that. So there are a number of ways to identify how to give people confidence. It really depends on what the cause of the lack of confidence might be.
So if I understand, so you're saying shifting modalities. So as I understand it, in your vernacular, modalities is the descriptive or the visualization we give to a sensation or inner feeling of some sort, such as a ring or a color and what have you. So as you said, when you're helping someone shift their modalities, what it sounds like, first of all, you're making them present to putting a picture. They're using visualization. They're being self-aware of where it is, how it feels. We talked about it, sort of the valence and the intensity of emotions in a sense.
Absolutely.
And then what I hear is that through this visualization of, I think the term was submodalities, you get them to shift the submodalities into something that works for them. So through this psychological process, this has almost an immediate effect on their physiological processes. Is this what I'm understanding?
Absolutely, you're understanding absolutely correctly, and we of course base that on an assumption that what we hold in our heads, the things we see, and what we feel, and how we hold our bodies are interrelated. They're systemic, right? So for example, we hear in our language, right? When someone's feeling sad, you go chin up. Right. Strangely, it's actually very hard to be depressed when you're doing this, right? And I'll describe it for our listeners because I know there's no video to this. But if you're standing, looking upwards, your body's erect, you're good posture, you're looking upwards, you got a big smile on your face. It's actually very hard to be depressed like that. As Charlie Brown once said, if you want to be depressed, you really need to stand in a depressed sort of way, right? So how you hold your body affects how you feel and how you think, right? Which is why, going back to what we said a little bit earlier about martial arts and conflict resolution, which is why balance is so important. If you're physiologically not balanced, emotionally and mentally, you will be less balanced. Right?
That's interesting. There's this triad of conflict negotiations, martial arts, and NLP. So if we bring it back to that white belt that we talked about, him or her earlier, and we were talking about confidence, if someone wanted to understand the modalities or submodalities of what's stopping them, whatever, aggression, anger, frustration, fear, overwhelm, what have you, are there a specific set of questions a white belt, just to use that term, could ask him or herself to walk them through using NLP to shift? And is there an organic or a natural way of asking these questions? And maybe could you share them with us?
Sure. And please understand that obviously I'm sharing them with you right now in this current context, so I'm asking them a certain way, right? But in the moment with a different set of circumstances, I might ask them in a different order.
Of course,
it really,
yes.
Yeah, it really depends, right? So, but essentially, what I'm trying to do firstly is getting them to identify what it is they're feeling, right? So, what do you feel? And if they have a term for it, that's great, like anger, fear, frustration, doesn't matter. Okay, even happiness, right? And if our listeners might want to try this I'm suggesting these questions to you, right? Excellent. So what are you feeling? And on the assumption it is a sort of a low valence sort of thing rather than a positive one, right? So it's sort of downwards. It's sort of like anger, frustration, that kind of stuff. Then my next question will be, where do you feel it? Point to it. Where in your body do you feel that emotion? Okay, and so let's say they point to the chest, for example. Then I say, okay, great. And if that feeling had a shape, what shape would it be? Would it be a circle? Would it be a square? Would it be a sphere? So I'm going to suggest 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional shapes, just in case they think it only has to be 2-dimensional, right? And they'll go, okay, well, it might be a sphere, for example. Then I say, great. And could you kind of show me with your hands how big that sphere is? Right, and they can demonstrate usually with their hands. So it's about like this, or it could be like this, right? Right. Then I go, great. And if it had a color, what color is it? And if it's anger, it's usually a color like red or orange, right? And I say, okay, so what you're telling me is that sphere that's here, pointing to the chest, which is this size, is red. Is that right? He goes, yeah. And of course, you're doing the whole active listening thing at the same time, right? Sure. And then I say, great. Does that sphere have any kind of sensation to it? Like, is it warm? Is it cool? Is it cold? Is it hot? Does it pulse? Does it sort of, does it vibrate? Does it have anything like that? And usually anger is actually, it's hot, right? And there's sort of like a sort of very sort of like jackhammer pounding sort of vibration to it.
Yeah.
Say, for example, right? And I'm using some universals here. Obviously, everyone's individual, but I've seen quite a few of these, and there seem to be some commonalities. Then I say, okay, great. So, what do you think yourself? What message does yourself want you to get from this particular feeling? That is a sphere at your chest, red, and vibrating like a jackhammer. So I'm trying to get them to see, do you get the message? And they may or may not consciously know what the message is, but some of them will actually say things like, oh, they want me to stand up for myself. And I'm like, great. They want you to stand up for yourself, right? And that's a good message, right? You should stand up for yourself, right? So go ahead and thank your sort of your unconscious mind, yourself, for wanting that for you. So now that you've got the message, would it be okay for you to stand up for yourself and not have to feel this way? And they usually go, yes, because you got a message, right? I mean, who wants to feel bad? I say, okay, so you want to play? Would it be okay if we play? Then I'd say, listen, what color would the sphere have to be in order for you to feel better and be able to stand up for yourself in a respectful sort of way? Then I'll let them take whatever color they tell me, and I'll say, okay, go ahead. go ahead and make the changes to that color, right? Go ahead, change it from red to whatever. And some can do it easily, some can do it with some practice, but most people can do that.
Sure.
I say, great. So how does changing the color make you feel now? What's different? And then they usually say, I feel more calm or something like that. Then I say, okay, great. And it's a sphere, right? What shape should it be? What shape would you like it to be in order for you to feel much better about yourself and be able to do these things respectfully? So I slowly take them through each of these things, right? And there's vibrations, or the vibration may, I want it to be a gentle pulsing, it's warm instead of hot. The sphere might actually be, I like it to be a sphere, but I think the sphere needs to be a little bit more smaller and more three-dimensional. I say, great. So I just one by one get them to change all those things. And it's obviously I'm summarizing it. It's
of course,
not as straightforward as that. But then it changes. They change. They feel differently about it, right? And that's in the moment, and there's no reason why that would take necessarily. They may go back to feeling how they used to feel. So I'd have to do rehearsal and connect it to sort of certain circumstantial contexts so that it would be triggered correctly the next time. So we call that future pacing, rehearsal, mental rehearsal, visual rehearsal, those kinds of stuff. But that's actually taking the change and putting it out into the future. Right. And in NLP, we call that future pacing, making sure that the change that happens in a room transfers out. And that's basically the kinds of questions I would ask, right? So what do you feel? Where do you feel it? What shape is it? What color is it? Does it have any sensation? What message do you think it's giving you? Show appreciation for that message. And then start making sort of small changes here for each of those modalities, see how that helps. Obviously, we're guided by our intuition, right? If you want to stop someone from being very angry, maybe the color should be blue and green rather than fire engine red.
Fiery red, yeah,
exactly. Right. So there's some universals you can draw on. But fundamentally, that's what I've been doing recently with some of the people I've worked with. And I've been doing NLP since, good Lord, 92, I think. 92, 94.
It was interesting when you were walking through, you said, do the exercise at home. And I was kind of doing it. It wasn't a negative emotion. I felt sort of curiosity. So that's what I was feeling. And then you said, where would it? And I kind of felt it in the center of my pecs, my pectorals, right there in the center of the chest. And then you said kind of what shape. And I had to think about that. And I saw it as a vessel. So I saw it as almost like a glass vase that was, transparent. And so it was a V-shaped vase. And so the curiosity, it started off slow as a drip, drip, drip. But I was visualizing this as you were talking. And so as the fluid was filling up this vase, and was more and more and more. But it was a mixture of different colors. Sometimes when you see oil and water, how it looks like that rainbow.
Yep.
That's how it had the swirling. And so it was just funny walking through. And for me, it was sort of an oil pattern of the different colors that you see swirling. And as you were talking more, the vase was getting wider and wider at the top, and it was filling more. And so the sensation was, it was almost like, sometimes when you're excited, you feel the sort of the endorphins, or you feel that sort of the little bit of adrenaline. So it wasn't exactly that, but this is what I was visualizing as I was talking about. And I found it I'm just sharing this for the hell of sharing it, but I just found it very curious when walking through it. As you were saying it, I thought, okay, why not go through the exercise? I just wanted to share that with you, Joel.
No, thank you for that. And actually, one of the interesting things about it, and I'm glad you brought it up, because you used obviously a feeling that was a positive one, right? So if you can imagine, actually, if somebody said, okay, I feel happiness, right? And you can do all the whole things, and you point to it where and all that, right? Now, obviously, we don't want to get rid of the happiness, and that's a good thing, right? But you could actually ask your questions and change the modalities in ways that, by asking them, so what color could it be for you to feel even more happiness than this? So in other words, you could actually increase the intensity of that particular feeling, right? So if it was a bigger sphere, how would you feel? And so I'd feel even happier. Wow, wonderful. Would you like it that way? Yeah, sure. Now, so you can actually use it to build even more intense curiosity, for example, or more overwhelming gratitude, happiness, whatever, right? And I think the key thing that one of the key things we're saying right now is actually you have some control over your emotions, right? We do say you feel what you feel, and that's okay. You don't have to act on it. But let's just say you wanted to act on it. There are things you could possibly do. Right? And you could, of course, practice this until it becomes almost automatic inside your mind.
It's fascinating. I've had this love-hate relationship with NLP for the longest time. I've been skeptical, and some things are like just really triggered my intrigue right into it. And obviously, talking to you today, my curiosity has been piqued again. So I was like, okay, maybe I should dive back into some of those old books that are somewhere in my attic, somewhere in my basement. So it's very interesting. Joel, I'm very respectful of your time. You've given lots of time today, and I really appreciate it. Is there any last tips or suggestions when it comes to conflict resolution or this triad we've talked about, NLP, the communication modalities, and martial arts and conflict negotiations you'd like to live with my listeners today?
Yeah, I think if because I thought quite hard about this just before I logged on, and I think the one key commonality between conflict resolution, NLP, and martial arts, or Wing Chun, as the case may be.
Wing Chun, yes.
The one key thing that I think is very, very important, that is like quintessential, is the notion of self-mastery. Mastery over the self. So, martial arts isn't about mastery over somebody else. It's actually mastery over yourself. Whether you define it as discipline, control, doesn't matter, right? But it's mastery of the self. NLP teaches you techniques to master yourself. Obviously, you can help somebody else master themselves, but essentially, I'm the direct recipient of some of these techniques. My mother is now Donald Duck in my mind, and it's a good thing. That's a good
Dad's
thing, right?
Mickey Mouse.
Right. Well, no. That's a different podcast, right? Yeah. And then for conflict resolution, again, if you can't manage your inner beast, as it were, your inner demon, how can you expect what you're trying to do outside to make peace, right? I leave you with I think two thoughts. William Ury, whom I mentioned a little bit earlier, one of his more recent works is a book called Getting to Yes with Yourself. Right. So the very first book was called Getting to Yes. Second book was Getting Past No. But one of his more recent ones was Getting to Yes with Yourself. I've read it. It's a great book. And that book, he's exploring essentially self-mastery. In order for you to be an effective conflict resolver, a negotiator, mediator, you need to have mastered yourself, right? So my last thought to you is, and our listeners, is a metaphor. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the story of the two wolves. So I believe it is a Native American story, Cherokee, I think, but I'm not entirely sure about that. And the story goes, this young Indian child, a Native American child, goes to his grandfather and says, I'm furious at so and so because he pushed me and I fell. And I'm so angry, I want to kill him. And obviously, that's a hyperbole. That's just the child expressing his anger. And the grandfather said, "Well, sit down for a moment," changing the physiology, right? And he says, "Take a deep breath." That's fine. That also changes the physiology. And the grandfather says, there are two wolves inside every one of us. And these wolves are constantly in battle. One wolf stands for anger, frustration, fear, greed, avarice, any list of negative things. The other stands for happiness, gratitude, love, camaraderie, loyalty, all the good things in life. And they are constantly in battle in every one of us. And the little Native American child goes, "Then, grandfather, which wolf wins?" And the grandfather in a sagely manner, strokes his non-existent beard and says, "The one you feed."
It's a great story. It really hammers home what we've been talking about this whole conversation.
Right. So I think fundamentally, if we want the world to be a better place, firstly, we need to feed the correct wolf inside us, even as we learn to do some of these things, these skills outside of us.
Well said. Brilliant story. Joel, thank you very much for the generosity of your time and sharing from all three disciplines that you've mastered over whatever it is since 87 to 92.
I can't count.
But I hope to get out to Singapore at some point, and maybe we can have over Chinese noodles.
Chinese noodles and a beverage of your choice. I would welcome you to Singapore anytime, and I'd be happy to show you around. But thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I had great fun. The time has flown. It didn't feel like an hour and a half at all. But so I love talking about this, and I hope we have future opportunities to talk about other things.
That'll be brilliant, Joel. Thanks again.
Take care, Jason.
In the second part of our conversation, Joel underscores the importance of addressing emotions as a fundamental step in conflict resolution. He says that identifying triggers and understanding emotional reactions are vital aspects. Expressing emotions can sometimes be challenging, especially when they are a blend of different feelings. To navigate this, he suggests employing Neuro-Linguistic Programming techniques, or NLP. He outlines a series of probing questions within NLP to unpack these emotions. For example, what is the emotion being felt? Where is it located in the body? What form does it take? Exploring its size, shape, color, and associated sensations such as temperature or weight adds in understanding the message behind the emotion. Additionally, envisioning what shape and color it would need to be to evoke a sense of improvement serves as a tool for emotional management and resolution. You know, folks, the conversation marked by an unconventional merging of conflict resolutions, martial arts philosophy, and NLP, well, it has been an exceptional and rare occurrence, a unique blend of disciplines. For me, it was an intriguing fusion that Joel navigated skillfully through, offering a fresh perspective on not only managing emotions, but conflict resolution technique. So for me, this conversation was a unicorn. It's not so often you can take three very unique disciplines and finding the overlapping principles that can help you in each one of those other disciplines. So a big thank you to you, Joel, for your time and this long-form discussion. I learned a lot, and you've intrigued and kindled my interest in NLP again. And folks, if any of you are interested in contacting Joel, I will leave all his contact information in the show notes. Well, folks, that brings us to a tail end of another fascinating episode. If you could do me a favor and suggest and recommend this podcast to two people you know, colleagues, friends, family, I would be very grateful and very thankful. Thanks for that. Well, folks, until next week, until the next time we speak, keep well, keep strong, and we'll speak soon.